There was an article in the news the other day of a submarine that had been resurrected. They had, several years ago, back in the mid-90s, they found a Confederate submarine. In fact, it was the first submarine in human history that they know of that successfully brought down another boat, basically by its torpedoes, or probably a little more rudimentary than that in the Civil War, where it was able to bring a ship down, but then this ship also sunk, this submarine. The men inside died, perished as they were on their mission. And just recently, they're trying to get all of the brine and all of the rust and all of the contamination off of this submarine so they can see more the technology that's in it. I mean, think about it. We're talking the mid-1800s. These men were able to survive underwater for a lengthy period of time. Obviously, didn't quite time it right as far as the air they had left. But there was an interesting aspect of the story that I had not heard before. When they first brought the boat up, they actually found inside of this submarine 7 sailors that had died, what was left of them and the inside, the hull of that submarine. And in 2004, as best we know, the last funeral or memorial service for a Civil War soldier was conducted in South Carolina in 2004. And I just find that fascinating. We're talking about a battle, and we're talking about a war that took place 150 years ago, and we're still impacted by that division. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Americans killing Americans during the Civil War. It's the deadliest war our country's ever been involved in. And I think sometimes when it comes to unity or a lack of unity, we do not see how much of a life and death kind of thing it is. Well, we just don't get along. Me and this family member, or me and this fellow church member, or me and this ministry partner. And we don't realize the threats, the dangers, the life and death kind of aspects of disunity. And what I want to talk about tonight, with the Lord's help, as we look at the context of our study tonight in Nehemiah 5, is how do we grow, how do we follow God's leading as families, as a church, without that growth and that stretching separating us or causing division where there needs to be greater unity. And I hope tonight God will work in your heart as He has mine in this area of pursuing unity. Now tonight, as you notice, if you're taking notes, the back of our bulletin has a brief overview of our outline. You're welcome to follow along. There are two adhesive, or two, if you will, we've got the graphic of a roll of duct tape. Maybe it's tape or glue, but something that holds things together. I believe God has given us two things that are found here in chapter 5 of Nehemiah that will help us follow God's leading, but do so together. And I hope that it'll strengthen the relationships that you have as you follow God's will. Number one, first of all, God keeps us together by giving to us mission alignment. Mission alignment. Any of you mothers especially, are you amazed at how quickly, if you have young kids, how quickly it can go from calm to, absolute chaos? Literally in 10 seconds, it's quiet, everybody's calm, and then all of a sudden, everybody all at once, there's like a conspiracy, things are spilled, crying begins to happen, and there's just chaos. And what was aligned and what was organized is now absolute chaos. Have you ever noticed when you try to follow God's will for your life, because it's a battle, because it's a struggle, because it takes faith and commitment, that also with that submission to God's will comes a vulnerability to chaos? Do things just neatly, fall into their proper places? Have you noticed the opposite is true? If you were to dump a pile of pins on the floor, they're not going to neatly arrange by themselves. I've seen some of your garages, all right, as I've visited with you, and it's amazing. You can't just throw things in there and they automatically just look nice and neat. In fact, the opposite happens. Chaos is a part of living in a sin-cursed world, and when we're following God, we need to know how to navigate and to stay on point and stay on task when that chaos comes our way. Now, here in our passage in Nehemiah chapter 5, the beginning of the chapter is basically this. You have people in the midst of all the work they're doing, they're calling in debts that other people in the nation owed, and they're basically selling them into slavery. Or you got this big task going on of building the wall, and then you got these businessmen and you got these people with their own agenda that are selling into slavery other Jews that owed them money or owed them responsibilities financially. And so there's absolute chaos in this situation, and Nehemiah, with God's help, has to reestablish mission alignment. Now, there are a couple of ways in which we do that, not just in the city of Jerusalem back in this day, but in our day, that help us stay on point. Number one, first of all, we need to remove what are the enemies of alignment. We need to remove what are the enemies of alignment. And the verses we just read are Nehemiah basically confronting those who are not moving in God's direction. They're not aligned with God's purpose. They have their own agenda. And as a result of that, there was confrontation that needed to take place. Have you ever had a car that's been out of alignment? That's fun to drive, isn't it? I remember a few times having either because of the actual alignment or something with the brakes or maybe even the tires I had on the car where you feel like you're driving on a washboard, you know. A couple times, you know, I've known of people who get in a car, you don't know it has alignment problems, and you just get right up to speed, and then, you know, the car's just walking all over the road. Things have to be aligned. And when there's not alignment, there's a lack of efficiency. There's a lack of the parts working together properly. And I will just tell you this tonight, you have to be convinced that without unity, you as a family, we as a church, the areas where you're with other people, that you will not be as efficient doing your thing while they're doing their thing as when we together are aligned in a common purpose and plan that God has. And so alignment is so important, and we need to confront where there are resistance to that. Now, a couple things I want to give you that these are not necessarily found in our text, but these are things that would be enemies of alignment. Number one, first of all, time. Here in this story, if you were to read the verses around the chapter, basically there's just been some time that's gone by and people are getting tired. They're now several weeks into the project. And have you ever noticed just the attrition of time, how it just wears you down? The longer I live, the more I appreciate those of you that are ahead of me when you're still faithful in areas that, man, with just time, there's a tendency, isn't there, just to give in and just to give up and just back off. And over time, people get distracted. They lose their passion. They get bored with the project. They begin to move in their own direction and with their own agenda. And it's not even that people necessarily want that. It's just what happens over time. And so we need to constantly be realigning in the midst of time going by to be on task for the Lord. We must remember that normal wear and tear eventually pulls the most committed team out of alignment. It just happens. And we have to work to keep it fresh and keep it new and keep it aligned in a way that pleases the Lord. Number two, a second enemy of alignment is this: crises. A crisis that comes up. It would be maybe an unexpected event or circumstance, and because of the crisis, whereas time would maybe wear down, a crisis in a moment reorganizes and maybe even disorganizes what to that point had been organized. And I would just submit to you tonight that though crisis demands attention, alignment cannot just be focused upon crisis. It must be focused upon purpose and mission that God has given. Imagine, if you will, a hospital. If they took all of their resources and all of their personnel and they focused on the ER department, and they spent all their time dealing with the crisis of each person as they walk in. Whereas obviously a hospital has a lot of other things they have to take care of as well. And I've found sometimes crisis, when something major comes into our life, it moves us off task. It gets us being disjointed and misaligned when we need to stay on point for the Lord. You and I cannot allow our pursuit of God's vision to be replaced with crisis management. I've noticed that in believers. The crisis needs attention, needs to be dealt with, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but I will just tell you, it is not the threats that should drive us and direct us. It's God's will. And I found in my life, sometimes it's my fears or it's my concerns that daily define and direct me when God should be the one to do so. And so time often will wear down our alignment. Crisis will wear down our alignment. Number three, our attitude. our attitude also can lead to disorganization and misalignment. The other day I saw a Vermont inventor, a gentleman who lives in Vermont, invented something new that to me takes the whole narcissism. Have you heard of selfies? People taking pictures of themselves. And there's a guy that just invented a toaster. And you can buy this toaster, and then somehow digitally you can take a picture off of your phone. I don't even think we have cameras anymore. We just have phones with cameras. But you can load a digital photo into the toaster, and it will burn onto the side of your piece of bread your picture. Can you imagine having the gall to do that? To me, that is the most self-absorbed thing you could do. Some of you can go Google it now and buy one before tomorrow. But, it's amazing how much we're consumed with ourselves. And I will tell you, the worst thing we can do for our family or for this church is just to be self-absorbed. Wait a minute, God's leading, but how does this affect me? Or God's not leading, and I wish it were because that affects me. And it's all about us. And so that focus, that attitude of focus will lead to a lack of alignment. Now, I want to list, and if you're taking notes, maybe jot down these things. Here are some ways in which you and I can hurt alignment that we need to be careful of. When a teammate loses sight of the vision, here's a few things that will happen. Maybe jot these down tonight. Number one, a person who has a wrong attitude or a wrong outlook, number one, they will attempt to control rather than serve. They will attempt to control rather than serve. Men, I think that's a challenge for us tonight in the areas of our family. I was mentioning this morning in our starting point class, I heard someone the other day say, what's with this servant leadership thing? Emphasizing that servant leadership. What other kind of leadership is there? Leadership serves. And if we're going to be aligned tonight, we must move away from this attitude of attempting to control rather than to serve. Number two, those who struggle with misalignment in their attitude. Number two, they will manipulate people and circumstances to further their own agenda. They will manipulate people and circumstances to further their own agenda. I've seen that in marriages, families. I've seen that in churches where disunity is the result of a person manipulating things to pursue their own agenda. So number two, they'll manipulate people and circumstances to further their own agenda. Number three, they will exhibit an unwillingness to resolve their differences face to face. They will exhibit an unwillingness to resolve their differences face to face. And I have found that one greatly hinders the work of God. They'll tell everybody else, and they'll comment about anything else to anyone else, but they'll not deal with it directly with that person. I mean, obviously there's no resolution in that. There's no hope or future in that. All right, number four, they'll refuse to believe the best about other teammates. They'll refuse to believe the best about other teammates. And that obviously would undermine team unity. They refuse to believe the best about other teammates. Number five, last one here, and this one I have noticed sadly is so often true in marriages and in churches and in families. They view team members' failures as their own personal successes. They view other team members' failures as their own personal successes. They enjoy making their husband look bad, their wife look bad, their teenage son or daughter look bad, their preacher look bad, their church member look bad. As a result of that attitude and that outlook, obviously there's a lack of alignment. And I would ask you tonight to pray on which of those five you have a tendency in and ask God to help refine us in those areas. So those things would lead to misalignment. And I hope you'll be willing to identify those. Okay, where am I letting time just wear me down? Number two, where am I allowing crisis to get me off task and off point? And number three, where am I allowing my own attitude to move things in a way that's disingenuous? All right, number two, if you will now, look at verse number 8. And notice the end of this verse. He says, Nehemiah speaking as he's confronting these people who are doing their own thing and therefore creating disunity. He says, I said unto them, we after our ability have redeemed our brethren the Jews, which were sold unto the heathen, and will ye even sell your brethren? Or shall they be sold unto us? Notice, then held they their peace and found nothing to answer. And if you go back to verse number 7, the end of the verse, it says, "And I set a great assembly against them." There was some meeting that took place. So next, number 2, also let's talk about some things that help with alignment. What are some things we can do over and over that will help keep us on task and on point with our spouse, with our family, with the ministry here? A couple of areas. First of all, number 1, meeting together. Nehemiah took the time to hold a meeting. You got the wall going, the wall needs built, and enemies are on the other side of what already has been erected of the wall, and yet he takes the time to meet. Can I just ask you tonight, whose responsibility in the Word of God is it when there is a difference, when there is a disagreement? Who is responsible? The one who has offended or the one who has been offended? Which one? It's a trick question. The answer is what? Both, right? If there's anything tonight in your life, and as God is my witness, as far as I know, I can live what I'm now about to tell you. I've had to work at it recently. But if there's any disunity in your life, you have a responsibility to meet with that person. You have a responsibility to say, hey, we need to work this out. We need to talk this out because there's a greater cause at stake. There's something greater than our little petty differences or maybe even something significant that needs to be discussed. The vision is at stake. God's plan and purpose is in peril, and we need to be realigned together. And it's interesting to me, if you notice in verse number 9, he goes on to talk about, he says, "It's not good that you do this. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of God because of the reproach of the heathen, our enemies?" He broadens the significance of this disagreement. Listen, God's reputation is on the line, and we need to work on this, and we need to fix this so that the world will know of our God. Here's a statement, I would jot it down. It's okay to have problems. It's not okay to ignore them. It's okay to have problems. Listen, part of working for the Lord, part of being in church and in family is you have friction. We're not talking about that's bad. We're saying when we ignore it, when we don't deal with it, we greatly hinder God's purpose and God's plan. All right, so first of all, we can enhance mission alignment by working through things with those that we have disagreement with. Number 2, also in our example, would you go to Ephesians chapter 4? And I think we have time to look at this. And can I just give you what should be the goal of every church? Ephesians chapter 4. And if you would please, look at verse 11. All right, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 11. And this is probably, as I mention often, this is probably the key chapter in my mind when it comes to local church, what it should be, what it should not be. And I draw your attention just to a couple of verses found in this chapter beginning in verse number 11. Ephesians, if you would please, chapter 4 and verse 11. He talks about different gifts that are given, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers in verse 11. Verse 12, for the perfecting the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ. Now notice the transition beginning in verse 13. Till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God unto a perfect man, and of the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro, and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men, cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. Then our theme verse as a church, speaking the truth in love, may grow up in Him in all things, which is the head, even Christ. Now notice verse 16. From whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, notice the end of this verse, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. That's the goal. That there's unity, that there's love, that there's edification. And I put this as gently as I can tonight, but when you cop an attitude, or I cop an attitude, we compromised our ability together to do what's described in verse 16. The devil, his ploy has always been with the church to do what? To divide and conquer. What's been his strategy with the family? To divide and conquer. I was mentioning this the other night on Wednesday night. I think sometimes we look at homes today, the fact that Christian marriages fail as much as secular marriages fail, and we see it as more dysfunction. Well, it's just people are just lazy, people are relationally they just don't care. No, the reason marriages are failing is because the devil's attacking them with everything he's got. It's a battle, and there's a war going on, and may we stand unified against that as families and as a church. couple things I would give you that will help you be an example. Would you make note of these things? First of all, number one, be a person of integrity. Nehemiah goes on in verses 10 to 13 to talk about he didn't take advantage. They're trying to get something out of these people, and Nehemiah didn't take anything from them. He had a right to, and yet he did not do so. Be a person of integrity. Number two, as I just mentioned a moment ago, resolve your differences face to face. Resolve your differences face to face. Number three, believe the best about others. Believe the best about others. And I think when we do those things, God will use us to help build unity in our family and in our church. I heard the other day a story of a family. They were a bunch of city slickers, and they bought a ranch out west, moved out west and bought this ranch. And their family and friends came from New York City to see this new ranch. I mean, they built this ranch, and man, it was pretty cool to go out and check it out. And finally, their friends asked this family, they said, what's the name of your ranch? What name did you come up with for your ranch? And the dad said, I wanted to name it Bar J. My wife favored Susie Q. One of our sons wanted Flying W, and the other liked Lazy Y. So we're calling it the Bar J, Susie Q, Flying W, Lazy Y. Friends thought for a minute, and they said, well, where are all these cattle on that long name that you just gave? And they said, well, none of them survived the branding. None of them survived the branding. Do you know how often our own little thing, though in and of itself maybe it's okay, but how unproductive that is sometimes? Mine, not just yours, but mine. And how often that undermines what God is trying to do. I think when it comes to following God's will, we have got to stop thinking about our will. I got to stop thinking about your will. You got to stop thinking about my will, or you about your will, or me about my will. We need to think about what He wants. And when we do that, now something good can happen, something lasting, something eternal. Here's the statement, and we'll move on. Vision thrives in an environment of unity. It dies in the environment of division. And I have been in places where I've seen it thrive, and if I'm honest, I can see why it did. God's people got together. My family got together. And I've also seen times where it has died, and often the death of that vision has been the direct result of carnal division. All right, number two, there's a second adhesive that God gives that helps us really keep things together as we stretch and grow for the Lord, and that is this. Number two, moral authority. Moral authority. If you will, now go back to our text in Nehemiah, and let's read a couple of verses toward the end of this chapter that give to us how Nehemiah was able to lead, and to lead in a way that was effective before these people and the division that faced him. Look, if you will, at verse 14. And we're not going to read all of these verses, but I'll just highlight a couple of them to you to show why Nehemiah was so effective in leadership in the face of all of this division. Verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year, even on the 2 and 30th year of Artaxerxes the king, notice, that is 12 years, I and my brethren have not eaten the bread of the governors. He goes on to talk about that the previous governors had required like a levy where they had gotten monies or they had gotten things to meet the needs of the governor's house. And Nehemiah said, I didn't do that. The whole time I was there, I did not require that. I didn't want to be a burden. I mean, they didn't even have walls. They didn't even have basic needs being met, and so he was considerate of that. If you will now go down to the end of the passage, it says in verse number 17, Moreover, there were at my table 150 of the Jews and rulers beside those that came unto us from among the heathen that are about us. I mean, that's a big spread there. Verse 18, Now that which was prepared for me daily was 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, also fowls were prepared for me, and once in 10 days store of all sorts of wine. Yet for all this required not I the bread of the governor, because the bondage was heavy upon this people. Notice now verse 19, Think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. I believe the reason Nehemiah, and I believe the reason any man or any lady in the areas we have leadership, that we're able to kind of keep others maybe that don't realize how disunity is hurting the cause of Christ or the purpose of God, the vision God has given, to lead in that time frame, we have to possess moral authority. 2 weeks ago on a Wednesday night, I was reading through Jonah chapter 1. Some of you were here and enjoyed a few good laughs at my expense, all right? And I was reading through Jonah, and it was, I think, about verse 8 or 9 where it talks about, Jonah's fleeing, and then this storm comes, and it talks about how the sailors, it said, and the men, is what I was supposed to say, and the men rowed hard to land. They didn't want to throw Jonah overboard, so they're trying to row. And so I had just kind of said, you guys all seem a little out of it tonight. And then I proceed to read the chapter, and I get to that verse, and I said, and the women rowed hard to land. And everybody kind of laughed, and I laughed. And then I went back to the verse, read it again, and said, and I said it again. I said it twice. And everybody, the guys were loving on me afterwards for that. Aren't you glad that you don't have to be perfect to be a leader? But I will say on the flip side, there must be progress, there must be integrity, there must be character. And I think, maybe you feel like I've been picking on you a little bit tonight in this first section as far as making sure that there is alignment, but I will tell you just as much a cause of disunity and losing God's vision and purpose is when leaders don't possess moral integrity and moral authority. And Nehemiah alone could deal with the situation because of what he had done and who he was in the eyes of the people. And so I just give you a few things tonight in this area of moral authority. First of all, number one, decide to influence others with moral authority. Decide to influence others with moral authority. You ever heard a parent say, do as I say, not as I do? Yeah, good luck with that, right? Someone the other day I heard said this, example is not the main thing in influencing others, it's the only thing. You have to be an example of the believer, an example of what God wants in a family and in a church. You're that example, and it is our moral authority. Listen, I love you tonight, but if you cut corners, you're cutting your influence. If you shave off the edges in some area of your life, it hurts us, it hurts your family. Dear men tonight, don't expect of your wives to follow your leadership when there is not moral authority in your heart. She knows it. And tonight you know it of me and you know it of the other leaders in this church. We need moral authority. Now, how do we get that? Well, a couple of areas. First of all, number one, in our reputation. I think sometimes we minimize that. Well, I just don't care what people think. I'm just going to do my thing. But our reputation often precedes influence. It precedes authority. Nehemiah had great reputation. He had a sterling reputation before the people. And you notice, if you go back to our text here, look again at chapter 5 and verse number 8, the end of the verse, it says, then held they their peace and found nothing to say. They had nothing to say. It wasn't what Nehemiah said about them, it's who he was and the authority that he possessed because of that. There have been people in my life, I can't argue with them because they're living what they're telling me to live. I can't debate with them. I can't discuss with them because it is true of their lives and they possess a proper reputation. How's your reputation tonight? Are you known as someone who is faithful in your family responsibilities? Known who's faithful in your church responsibilities? Are you known for that? It's when our reputation is less than that we undermine God's purpose and God's plan. Second, number two, I think also we not only need good reputation, we also need persuasion. We lead with persuasion. Nehemiah silenced the opposition with his moral authority. Tonight, may I remind you, nothing compensates for the lack of moral authority. No amount of communication skills, wealth, accomplishment, education, talent, or position can make up the difference when there is a margin between what you claim to believe and what your behavior actually is. You ever had someone in your life try to influence you? They talk the talk, but they're not walking the walk. Maybe you've worked for a boss like that, or you've maybe been in a family situation or church situation where someone's in authority and they're not living what they're asking of you or what they're speaking. I remember having a coach, I won't get into the specifics, but let's just say he didn't know a lot about the sport he was coaching me in. And my parents were very good at supporting his authority and keeping my attitude where it should be as a young man. But there was a margin between what he was saying and his knowledge of the game, of the sport we were playing. Have you ever been under a leader like that? You ever been a leader like that? To persuade, there must be moral authority. There must be integrity that gives us influence with others. Someone has said this: moral authority positions you to influence people on the deepest level: heart, mind, conscience. And until we have moral authority, we will not persuade anyone of anything that's of lasting significance and value. It is the alignment between a person's convictions and his behavior that makes his life persuasive. It makes it persuasive over the long haul. Number two, so first of all, we need to decide to influence others with moral authority. Number two, and this is where we get a little more specific tonight, we need to discipline ourselves to increase our moral authority. Discipline ourselves to increase moral authority. Have you ever been in a doctor's office, and you sit there for 3 hours and they come in for 10 minutes and then bill you for whatever? I'm not picking on the medical people even in the room today. But have you ever noticed the prescriptions they write for you? Have you ever tried to read your doctor's handwriting? Does that make you nervous? I mean, the guy can't even sign his name, and he's giving me drugs, and I'm going and trusting this guy. It's almost like to be an effective doctor, you can't read the name. The more sloppy, the more qualified you are. Sometimes we're a little sloppy in how we influence others. We give out things to our kids or to our spouse or to fellow church members, and there's a lack of discipline and structure in our own life. May I give you a couple things tonight as we finish that help develop greater moral authority. If you say, Pastor, as I'm leading others, I feel like I'm a little hollow in some areas. There's just not the spiritual backbone and the internal fortitude spiritually that I need. Here's some things that maybe will help you in that area. First of all, number one, if we're going to develop more moral authority, we need to develop our character. Develop our character. Did you notice the end of verse 19 that we just read, that Nehemiah prays this prayer? He says, "Think upon me, my God, for good." Nehemiah was not using moral authority as just a technique. He was doing it for God. He was trying to be right in God's sight, not just in the sight of man, but ultimately in the sight of God. And character is simply the will or the desire to do God's will. God, I want to please you. I want to honor you. Think about in the Bible, every time it lists spiritual leadership, what does it emphasize? Character. Character is king. Man, we live in a day where that's not true, is it? Those that are leading think they can lead with just a position or a label, and there's not the character that needs to be there for influence. Character is king. Character is key to being an effective leader for the Lord. And if tonight you feel like you have very little realm of influence, you may feel like no one's listening to you, no one's following you, no one's impacted by you for the cause of Christ, I would tell you the best place to start would be develop some character. Keep growing your character. God, I want to be right with you. I want to be used by you to impact others. Number two, secondly, we also can develop character or greater moral authority, not just through character, but through sacrifice. Through sacrifice. We were up in Maine this past summer on vacation, or this summer, I guess we're still in summer. I guess the weather this past week makes it feel like it's past. But I had not seen this for a while, but we went into a DQ, a Dairy Queen, and my sons, Ian and Landon, they ordered a Blizzard, and I ordered a Blizzard. We were waiting on Heidi to finish something up. And have you ever had them, you order your Blizzard, what do they do with it sometimes? You ever seen them do it? They tilt it over. I tried, I don't know why they do it. I was just to prove the consistency of, the ice cream, why they do it per se, but it's been around as long as DQ has, that Blizzards, they tip it over to prove to you it'll stay in the cup. Do you know to be what God wants us to be, not just you by yourself and me by myself, but together, we have to be characterized by sacrifice. And I believe truly for us to blend together, to be unified with our family members and with fellow church members, we have to be upside down first. We have to sacrifice. We have to give of ourselves. We have to give up ourselves so that we can merge together for the Lord. And I want to give you a quick verse on that found in the New Testament. Would you go to Acts chapter 17? Kind of that imagery of being turned upside down. In this area of sacrifice, I think we're missing it in our day. I think of all the things in our church that we're weak in, starting with me, I would say this probably is one of the ones we're most vulnerable in. We're not willing to sacrifice. And I'd encourage tonight to be open to greater sacrifice with the Lord's help. Acts chapter 17, if you would, look at verse number 6. You have a chaotic moment as God is working through the early believers, and I just want you to notice a phrase found at the end of verse number 6. It says this, "And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying." All right, you've got this tumult, you have this great crowd and almost a mob-like scene in the first few verses of the chapter. Notice what they now cry to the rulers of the city. "These that have turned the world," notice this, "upside down, are come hither also." And the question I would ask you tonight is this: what is it going to take for our church? Listen to me. What is it going to take for us to really make a difference in our county? What's it going to take for us to make a difference in our world today for the cause of Christ? It's going to take a group of committed, sacrificial people. They're willing to sacrifice themselves and their little thing for the greater thing, the big thing that God has given to them. These people in Acts, I'm amazed by their sacrifice. I think many of us, when we meet them someday, think about that, meeting some of these people in heaven. And we contrast how hard they had it as opposed to how plush and convenient and comfortable our version or brand of Christianity often is. They turned the world upside down because they were willing to be turned upside down themselves to sacrifice for the cause of Christ. It's when we hold on to our things, it's when we are territorial of our possessions and our time and our abilities, the division creeps in. I've just noticed that sacrificial people naturally get along. They just seem to work pretty well together. And those of you doing so, I encourage you to keep that up. And those that need to do that may encourage you to do so more. See, sacrifice is a tangible, demonstrative way of showing we are committed to God's vision. We can say we're committed to it, but it's until we sacrifice that it's really evident to others. Is your sacrifice pleasing to God as it's seen by others? Now, lastly, number 3, and this may be something that you're in the process of right now. Number 3, often it just takes time. It takes time to develop moral authority. Most of the people in the room that have influence in our church, that have influence in your family, it hasn't come just overnight. It's taken time. I found the conversations and the testimony that I have in this community that it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to develop, and it grows and it matures. You ever heard the term long in the tooth? You know, man, that's a little long in the tooth, or they're a little long in the tooth. A reference to horses. Horses, their teeth, at least as far as I know, they never stop growing, and you can tell the age of a horse based upon the length of its teeth. Some of us, it's just going to take a little more time to develop influence and develop encouragement that others can receive from our life, and we just need to be faithful over and over, day to day, and over time God will use that to bring glory to His name. And I've found as we do right over time that our life begins to emphasize our words and emphasize our beliefs. Nehemiah, think about this, his life lined up with his lips. Wouldn't that be nice to have in our politicians today? Man, that would just one. That's all I'm praying. Just one, that their life and lips align. I'm being facetious. There are some that do that. But for us to influence others, we need to make sure that over time our lives align with that which we claim to believe about God. And when we're faithful, God will unify us together in that. I was thinking the other day of the story of Abraham. Do you remember Abraham? God said to him, "Abraham, I'm going to bless you." And He gave him a vision. And in that vision, He was going to take one boy named Isaac, and through him, all nations of the earth would be blessed. And I want you to think about, what did God ask him to do with that son, Isaac, the son of promise? He asked him to do what? Sacrifice him. And Abraham, listen to me, he had to choose between pleasing God or doing what logically led to the fulfillment of even the vision and the leading God had given to him. And here it is tonight. To be a leader, to be someone who's influencing and encouraging others, let's follow God, let's do His will, let's be moved by His vision for our lives. We have to be willing to sacrifice even the vision to be right with God. We have to be willing to give up anything that compromises our relationship with God and our testimony before man. And when we're willing to abandon the vision, even the vision, to please God, now we can see clearly what the next step is in our walk and in God's will for us. I read a statement the other day. You may want to jot this down. To me, it just boiled down the truths we've been looking at tonight. Here it is. Christian ministry, it appears, is ministry together. Christian ministry, it appears, the author said, is ministry together. Listen to me, I don't think we can do Christian ministry by ourselves. You wouldn't be here tonight, would you? I mean, think about some of the crazy things we put up with as church members. I mean, you got to deal with me every week, and you got to deal with other people in this room, and just the time and commitment and the challenge that goes with it. I know at times it can be mind-boggling. But we cannot do Christian ministry by ourselves. We need each other. We need to be in communion and unity with one another for the purpose God has given. I end with this quote from a gentleman I respect. He wrote this. He said, "We are at the center of the greatest purpose God has designed, the redemption of man. God has given to us, His church, the ministry of reconciliation. When we recognize that the issue at stake is not our own personal status, but the souls of men, we will shun division within our local churches. We must unify around the faith of the gospel. It is our standard. It is our rallying cry. We do not compromise the message because it is the power of God unto salvation. It is what binds the members of each local body together. Alone, Christians are stray sheep waiting to be devoured by the adversary. Together, the church is a protected body that even the gates of hell cannot prevail against. This is why we must strive together." And I'm telling you, there's a greater plan and purpose for your life than you getting your way. There's a purpose greater and grander than just you getting your life out of it what you desire. And I believe God has called us together to do a great work for Him and to bring Him glory and honor. The question tonight is this: are you willing to contribute to keeping us gelled and unified together by, number one, first of all, being willing to stay aligned with the mission? Why are you here tonight? Why are you going to be here next week? Why are you going to do your Christianity this week? Do you have the mission God wants you to have? And number two, do you possess moral authority? Listen, when you speak, can God use that? When you demonstrate something, can God use that? Because there is an alignment between what you say and what you do. My prayer is God will help me to be on task, to stay within the mission God has given, and to be a leader that leads with moral authority. Let's pray. Father, thank you tonight for your word. Thank you, God, for the privilege it is to preach it.